The fluorescent lights hummed their mechanical monotone as Natalie Hayes pushed through the staff entrance of Cedar Creek Medical at 10:41 p.m., her badge clipped to the pocket of her scrubs. The smell hit her first, that blend of antiseptic and something older, something that lived in the walls of every hospital, the ghost of 1,000 recoveries and 1,000 failures. She'd chosen the night shift deliberately. Fewer eyes. Fewer questions. 6 months she'd been here, and in 6 months, nobody had asked her name. That was exactly how she needed it. The ER nurse station occupied the central hub of the floor, a glass-walled command center overlooking 12 patient rooms arranged like spokes on a wheel. Monitors glowed blue and green in the dimness. A resident hunched over a laptop, hunting for something in the electronic medical records system. 2 nurses from the day shift were doing their handoff, speaking in the clipped shorthand of people who'd done this 10,000 times before. Natalie moved past them like water finding its level, invisible, competent, unremarkable. She'd spent 12 years learning how to be seen without being noticed. The military called it tradecraft. Cedar Creek Medical just thought she was quiet. Her locker stood in the back corner of the supply closet on the 2nd floor, a space no wider than a coffin, lined with industrial grey metal shelving holding boxes of sterile gauze, compression bandages, and the 1,000 consumables that kept a hospital running. She hung her jacket on the hook and pulled her shift bag from the locker's interior. That's when her hand found the folded flag, tucked deep against the back wall where the metal curved cold against her palm. The fabric was faded now, the colors nearly bleached by 6 months of darkness. It wasn't regulation. It was cotton, worn soft as prayer by hands that had carried it through fire in Ramadi, through the kind of heat where the air itself felt hostile. She didn't unfold it. She never did, not here. But she held it for exactly 7 seconds, let her thumb trace the creases, and tucked it back where it belonged. Some anchors couldn't be visible. The night shift began like every other night shift at Cedar Creek. She checked in at the nurse station, reviewed the census board, and started her rounds on the post-operative patients recovering from surgery. Room for 41 held a 63-year-old retiree 3 days post-appendectomy, stable, sleeping. Room for 43 had an orthopedic case, hip replacement, already dozing through the evening news on a muted television. Room for 45 was empty, bed striped down and waiting. But room for 47 was where her attention had been calibrated since the moment his helicopter touched down at Grady Memorial 3 weeks ago before his emergency transfer here. The 4-star general lay in room for 47, asleep under a thin blanket, his chest rising and falling with the steady rhythm of a man whose body didn't know it had just been cut open and reassembled. Post-operative day 2. Standard sternotomy for a cardiac valve replacement. The chart said routine. The chart was a beautiful lie. General Marcus Halloway wasn't routine. He was her son's commanding officer. He was the reason she'd burned through 12 years of JSOC clearance to get inside Cedar Creek Medical in the first place. And the reason she couldn't let anyone know she was anything other than what her badge said, registered nurse. She checked his vitals without letting her hands shake. Blood pressure 118/76. Heart rate 68, strong and regular. O2 saturation 98% on room air. The surgical site beneath his gown showed no signs of infection, the incision line was clean, the surrounding tissue pink, not red. She made a note in the electronic chart, her documentation meticulous, her observations precise enough to catch what other nurses missed. A slight asymmetry in his breathing pattern. A barely perceptible favor of his left side when he'd shifted in his sleep. Nothing critical. Nothing that would flag on any monitor. But things a combat medic would notice. Things a field surgeon would understand. She was still reviewing his chart when Dr. Pierce appeared at the nurse station, his white coat moving like a sail through still water. He was tall in the way some men are tall, not from height alone but from the way he occupied space, taking more than his share, leaving nothing for anyone else. His shoes clicked on the tile floor with a sound like a judge's gavel. Expensive shoes. Everything about him was expensive, from the Rolex visible beneath his cuff to the way he spoke to residents like they were waiting staff at his personal restaurant. Hayes. Not a greeting. An identification. Walk me through the general's post-op orders. Natalie turned from the computer, her face arranged in the expression she'd perfected over 6 months, neutral, attentive, slightly deferential. 4-star General Holloway is post-op day 2 from aortic valve replacement. Vitals stable. Incision clean. I've got him on the antibiotic protocol and the DVT prophylaxis as ordered. No complications noted. Pierce moved closer, pulling the chart from her hands with a motion that didn't quite qualify as grabbing but arrived in the same neighborhood. His eye scanned the page, his jaw tightening slightly. Detailed observations here. Very detailed. Careful documentation prevents complications, doctor. He kept reading. She could see his mind working behind his eyes, calculating something. When he looked up, there was a coldness there that had nothing to do with temperature. The general's insurance authorization. What do you know about it? The question landed differently than his previous questions. Her pulse didn't change. Her breathing remained steady. But something in her recognized the way a predator recognizes another predator. I don't typically handle the insurance side, doctor. That's billing and admissions. Right. You focus on the nursing side. He handed the chart back, but slowly, with a precision that felt like a gesture of power. That must keep you very busy. He walked away before she could respond, his footsteps receding down the corridor toward the offices where the real business of hospitals happened, the financial architecture that determined which patients got which treatments and which treatments somehow cost 3 times what they cost at the hospital across town. She watched him disappear around the corner, then looked down at the chart in her hands. Her documentation was going to be a problem. She'd written it like a combat medic, precise and comprehensive in the way that came from understanding that missing a single detail could mean a death you could have prevented. But Pierce was noticing things. Asking things. And a man like him didn't ask questions he didn't already know the answers to. The room went quiet except for the ambient sounds of the hospital at night, the ventilator wheeze from the room across the hall, the distant ding of an elevator, the fluorescent lights vibrating at a frequency most people couldn't hear but always felt. She made her way back to room 447, where the general slept on, unaware that the chess game had just begun. His breathing remained strong. His color remained good. But there was something in the way his hand lay across the blanket, open, unclenched, the hand of a man who'd spent his entire career holding weapons and now held nothing but recovery. She understood what it meant to be a soldier caught in a place where soldiers weren't supposed to exist. She understood cover. She understood the loneliness of being one person to everyone except yourself. She checked his foresight, adjusted the rate on his morphine pump, and made one more notation in his chart, something mundane, something about his pain level and his temperature. Nothing that would draw attention. Nothing that would tell anyone that a captain with 12 years of combat medicine was standing at this man's bedside, watching him breathe. Natalie kept her eyes on the monitors while Dr. Pierce entered the ICU at 8:41 a.m., the morning light cutting through the corner windows like he owned it. 20 medical students trailed behind him in their pressed white coats, all of them still young enough to believe credentials meant competence. He moved through the unit with the kind of casual authority that came from knowing nobody would question him, his voice carrying the particular cruelty of someone who'd never faced consequence. He stopped at her station. Her hands continued their work, documenting vitals, checking the 4 line on General Holloway's saline drip. The general slept, his breathing steady, his post-operative vitals exactly where they should be. Ms. Hayes, Pierce said, his tone the way someone might announce a contamination. Grand rounds. Now. She followed him to the conference room where the students assembled, their phones already tucked away, their attention sharpened by the electricity of whatever spectacle was coming. Pierce held up her charting, the pages almost luminescent under the fluorescent strips overhead. He didn't look at her once. This, he announced, addressing the students as if Natalie was a specimen behind glass, is what happens when someone confuses observation with analysis. Look at this documentation. 4-hour gaps between neurological assessments on a post-operative cardiac patient. Medication reconciliation listed as reviewed without detail. Vital sign trends completely absent from her shift notes. The students leaned forward, committing this to memory. One of them, a blonde woman in the third row, glanced at Natalie with something that might have been sympathy. Charting like this doesn't just hurt the patient, Pierce continued, and now his voice took on the rhythm of a performance, something he'd clearly practiced. It exposes this hospital to liability. It tells families that Cedar Creek Medical employs staff who cut corners. It tells regulators that our standards have slipped. He held up Natalie's badge, her actual identification badge, like it was evidence. Like the laminated card with her photo and credentials was proof of negligence instead of duty. Her jaw tightened. That was all. A single muscle contraction, barely visible, the kind of thing a person watching carefully might catch and a person watching casually would miss. The bar for excellence, Pierce said, turning to face the students directly, is not just competence. It's attention to detail. Accountability. Everything Ms. Hayes' shift notes lack. The room was silent in that way hospitals become silent when someone's reputation is being systematically dismantled. Nobody moved. Nobody spoke. The air felt heavier, charged with the specific electricity of watching someone be professionally eviscerated in front of an audience. Natalie didn't look away from Pierce. She didn't look down. She didn't apologize or defend or explain. She simply stood there with the kind of calm that comes from having already survived worse, so much worse, that a man in a pressed coat reading her charting to students felt almost quaint. Pierce's eyes narrowed, just slightly. He'd expected something. A flinch. A stammer. An excuse. Something he could use. Instead, he got a woman whose composure was so complete it felt like a weapon. "Return to your station," he said, and turned back to the students. She walked out. Her shoes made no sound on the tile. Her breathing didn't shift. But her right hand, the one that had held a field dressing in remedy while round snapped past, was the only part of her that acknowledged what had just happened. Her fingers pressed together just hard enough to steady themselves. The vending machine sat on the third floor near the break room, its fluorescent glow casting everything in pale shadow. Natalie had intended simply to grab coffee before the day shift's chaos ramped up, had intended to be in and out in 30 seconds. Instead, she found herself standing next to Dr. Reynolds, a resident who'd been on the trauma service last month, and another physician she didn't recognize. They weren't talking about patients. They were talking about her. "Pierce is building a file," Reynolds was saying, his voice the careful volume people used when they thought they were discreet and absolutely weren't. "I heard him on the phone with compliance yesterday. Said he was documenting inadequate charting patterns." The other doctor, whose name tag read Morrison, laughed. It was the kind of laugh that felt jagged. "How long before security escorts her out?" "Week, maybe 2, Reynolds said. "Once he gets the documentation right. You know Pierce. He doesn't move until he's got everything bulletproof." Natalie stood at the machine, reading the selection of coffee packets like they were the most fascinating thing she'd ever seen. Her fingers, when she punched in her selection, were steady. When the cup dropped and the hot water filled it with a hiss, she watched the steam rise without flinching. When she reached for the cup, her hand didn't tremble. She turned toward the break room. Past Reynolds and Morrison directly. Neither of them seemed to see her, really see her, as she moved past. She was just the background of their conversation, the setup for their speculation. "Quiet," Reynolds said to Morrison as she passed. She didn't turn around. The supply closet on the 4th floor was empty at 9:13 a.m., the kind of space nobody visited unless they needed something specific. Natalie closed the door softly behind her and stood in the half-light, surrounded by boxes of gauze and sterile drapes and fur tubing coiled like mechanical snakes. Her hand went to her locker at the back of the closet, where she kept the extra supplies. But that wasn't what she reached for. That wasn't what her fingers found among the spare compression stockings and the backup scrubs. The folded flag was small enough to fit in her palm. It had come from Ramadi, 6 years ago, a replacement burial flag for Lieutenant Marcus Chen, her teammate, her brother in everything but blood. The flag had been presented to his mother at Arlington. The one she carried was a copy, something she had no right to have, something that violated a dozen regulations and protocols. She held it now, folded into a perfect triangle, and her breath finally caught. Not the dramatic kind, not the trembling kind that showed in shoulders or throat. Just the kind of catch that happened when someone remembered that the thing they were protecting, the reason they were here, the mission, the cover, had cost something. Had cost someone. General Holloway wasn't just a patient she was monitoring. He was Marcus's commanding officer. He was the man who'd signed the orders that sent 12 soldiers into Jolin District. He was the man who'd written the citation for Marcus Chen's Silver Star, posthumous. There were 83 names in Natalie's operational file. 83 men and women in the Special Forces command structure who had no idea that the nurse who was documenting their post-operative care had operated for 3 years under the callsign Ghost. That she had 15 confirmed kills in defensive operations. That her hands had held more lives together than any scalpel at Cedar Creek Medical ever could. But Dr. Pierce was building a file, carefully documenting her failures, preparing her termination with the methodical precision of someone who didn't want anyone to see the truth. Which was that he'd noticed her presence. He'd noticed her knowledge. And he was going to burn her cover before she could see what he was hiding. The flag trembled slightly in her grip. Her eyes were dry. She could abort. She could call the Pentagon number buried in a burner phone in her apartment. She could extract and let someone else take the mission. Someone who hadn't compromised their cover. Someone who didn't have personal stakes with the patient. But there were still 43 more days until General Holloway was cleared for discharge. 43 more days until he was safe. And if she pulled out now, if she ran, then whoever had placed Pierce at Cedar Creek, whoever had turned him into a liability, would still be there. Still taking money. Still inflating charges for disabled veterans. Still feeding on the system designed to protect men like Marcus Chen. She opened her hand. The flag sat in her palm, precise and folded and contained, just like she was. Just like she had to be, for 43 more days. But when she opened the supply closet door and stepped back into the hallway, something had shifted. Her shoulders sat lower. Her walk had changed, still controlled, still precise, but with the kind of economy that came from carrying a very specific weight. The day shift started at 6 p.m. At 1:27 a.m., when the hospital settled into that particular quiet that belonged only to night shifts, when the skeleton crew was scattered across 4 floors and nobody was paying attention to anything except the patients directly in front of them, the monitors on the cardiac unit began their chaos. The sound came first, not the flatline beep of television, but something more complex and terrible. A chaotic whisper of electrical noise that meant the heart wasn't beating, was firing randomly, was tearing itself apart from the inside. General Holloway's monitor erupted. Natalie was 6 feet away. She moved before the alarms registered. Before the RN at the station looked up. Before anyone else understood what was happening. The general's eyes were already rolling. His body went rigid and then collapsed into the specific helplessness of sudden cardiac arrest. Natalie was at his bedside before the second breath, assessing, calculating. His skin was already cooling. His pupils were dilating. Code blue, cardiac ICU, room for 47, she said into the phone, her voice perfectly level. 4-star patient, post-op day 4, ventricular fibrillation, no response to verbal stimulus. The code team would be 4 minutes out. Maybe 3 if they were lucky. The general had maybe 5 before brain damage became permanent. Maybe 7 before he was gone. She was already reaching for the crash cart, her hands moving with a fluidity that belonged to someone who had done this under circumstances significantly more complicated than a hospital room. Under fire. In a building that was actively being breached. In a room where the patient had a sucking chest wound and the alternative to acting was body bags. Muscle memory took over. It always did, in those moments when thinking was too slow. The defibrillation pads went on clean, fast, precise. Clear, she said, and shocked him once. The monitor showed resistance, electrical noise with no organized rhythm underneath. Dr. Pierce burst through the door, and for a single second the world seemed to compress. His eyes went to the monitor. To the general. To Natalie standing at the bedside with the defibrillator paddles already reset. "Get away from the patient," Pierce said. "Compressions," she said to the RN who'd arrived in her wake, a woman named Sarah Chen, no relation, who understood immediately what was needed. Natalie was already pushing Epi into the 4 line, her fingers moving like she was conducting an orchestra no one else could hear. "I said get away from." "He's in VFib," Natalie said, her voice carrying the kind of quiet authority that came from knowledge, from experience, from having seen things that made hospital hierarchy feel almost theoretical. "He needs compressions and rhythm checks every 2 minutes. The epi won't be adequate. We need amio." She was already reaching for the amiodaron. 300 milligrams, drawn up clean and fast. Into the 4. Reset. Shock again. The monitor held the electrical chaos for another beat, and then something shifted. A rhythm emerged underneath. Weak. Slow. But organized. A pulse returned. The general's eyes fluttered. The code team arrived at 2:04 a.m., breathless and already assessing. Pierce was still standing in the corner of the room, his face the color of someone who had just watched something he wasn't prepared to see. Sarah Chen was already documenting what had happened. "Patient converted to normal sinus rhythm after second shock," she wrote. "Quick intervention by charge nurse. Vital stable. Patient responsive." But when Natalie turned, Dr. Pierce wasn't looking at the general anymore. He was looking at her hands. At the way she moved. At the absolute absence of any hesitation or doubt. And something flickered across his face that looked almost like recognition. But that wasn't the worst part. That wasn't what would end her career in the next 46 hours. That wasn't what would blow everything open. The cardiac monitor went haywire at 2:06 a.m. One sustained wail. Flat line. The general's heart had simply stopped, no warning, no trajectory, just a green line going dead in the darkness of room 447. Natalie was already moving before the alarm finished its first oscillation, her feet carrying her down the corridor with the economy of motion that came from 8 years of trauma surgery in places where hesitation meant body bags. The night shift was skeleton crew. 2 nurses covering 22 beds. Dr. Reeves, the on-call surgeon, was somewhere in the bowels of the hospital finishing his turkey sandwich in the surgeon's lounge, a 47-year-old with a tremor in his hands that worsened after his second drink of the evening. He'd had 2 drinks. Natalie knew his patterns. She'd been watching everyone's patterns for 6 months. She burst into room 447. The general lay motionless, his post-operative chest still bandaged from the routine cardiac valve replacement 12 hours prior. Everything had gone textbook. Recovery was supposed to be textbook. This was not textbook. "Get Reeves on the phone," Natalie said to Marcus, the night nursing assistant, her voice level as a runway. "Tell him we need him in for 47. Now." Marcus bolted. Natalie was already unsnapping the general's hospital gown, her hands moving to the defibrillator pads on his chest. She hit the button. The machine hummed to life, analyzing, searching for any electrical signal worth salvaging. The seconds crawled like wounded animals. No shockable rhythm, the defibrillator announced in its mechanical monotone. Natalie's jaw tightened. She grabbed the ambu bag from the wall mount and locked it over the general's face, forcing oxygen into lungs that weren't asking for it. Her fingers found his carotid artery. No pulse. 8 years in the field had taught her how to feel the difference between fading and gone. This was gone. Reeves appeared in the doorway 30 seconds later, his surgical scrubs from earlier still on, coffee stain on the front. His eyes went wide. What happened? Cardiac arrest. No shockable rhythm. Asystole. Natalie's voice had dropped an octave, each word a command instead of a question. She was already starting chest compressions, the heel of her hand driving down toward the spine with the mechanical precision of someone who'd done this 17 times under live fire. First round epi running. Reeves moved toward the code cart like a man wading through water. His hands were shaking. Not the tremor from the bourbon, actual trembling. His eyes darted to the monitors, to the general, back to the monitors. He fumbled for the defibrillation pads already attached to the patient. "We need to, should we wait for?" "We don't have time to wait," Natalie said, not looking up. 30 seconds since arrest. "Right." "Yes." Reeves reached for the crash cart. His hand hovered over the medication tray. 1 milligram epinephrine, for push. It was the first thing they taught you in medical school. The first response in any code. His fingers trembled as they found the vial. Natalie continued compressions. 1, 2, 3, for 30 beats, smooth as a metronome, the heel of her hand finding the same spot on the breastbone with the kind of precision that came from doing it 100 times in the chaos of a Ramadi Field hospital where the only anesthesia was morphine and the only prayer was that your hands remembered the way. 60 seconds. Still nothing. The monitor showed nothing. Second round, Natalie called out. She was breathing steadily, her voice never wavering even as sweat beaded at her temples. 75 compressions per minute. Hold that. Reeves pushed the epinephrine. His hand was so unsteady the fawn needle nearly slipped from the port. "We need atropine," Natalie said. 0.5 milligrams. 3 minutes of CPR, then we reassess. Reeves was reaching for the wrong drawer. Atropine was in the other one, in the labeled slots he should have memorized years ago. He fumbled. The second stretched like pulled taffy. Natalie didn't stop compressing. Didn't hesitate. Didn't even glance at him. Her hands did the math that his panicked brain could not. She knew, had always known from the moment Pierce started circling her in the hospital like a shark testing the water, that if anything happened to the general on her watch, she would be the one who had to fix it. Not because she was a nurse. Because she wasn't. The monitor spiked. A single beat. Then another. Then a rhythm, fragile as tissue paper, but rhythm. "Sinus tachycardia," Natalie said. Her voice was steady as a surgical laser. "BP 88/52 and rising. Get me in 4 bolus of normal saline, 2 liters wide open." He's shocky but perfusing. She released her hands from the general's chest. Oxygen saturation, 79% and climbing. 82, 85. She'd been counting the seconds in her head while everyone else had been counting the minutes. She'd been watching the monitor while everyone else had been watching her. The room was silent except for the ventilator's mechanical hiss and the steady beeping of the cardiac monitor. Marcus stood frozen in the doorway, his eyes locked on her hands. Reeves stared at her, his face the color of wet concrete. "That was, you performed CPR with." 30 compressions, Natalie said. She was already running the bolus, checking the general's pupils, assessing perfusion by watching the color return to fingertips that had been blue 30 seconds ago. He's stabilizing. Oxygen saturation 91% now. We need an EKG. Portable. Now. No one moved. They were all looking at her the way you look at something that doesn't fit into the category you've assigned it. Reeves cleared his throat. I'll call cardiology. They need to know about the arrest." "Already coded them through the operator," Natalie said. She didn't look up from the 4 lines she was adjusting. "Tell them post-operative day 1, spontaneous arrest, responsive to ACLS, currently stable sinus rhythm with good perfusion. They'll want an EKG before rounds." The way she said it, not tentatively, not like a nurse asking permission, but like someone who'd called in 100 codes and knew exactly what each specialty needed to know, made Reeves take a step back. He left the room without another word. Natalie checked the general's pupils again. Reactive. Both sides equal. She ran her fingers along the suture line of his chest incision, checking for any sign of bleeding or separation. Everything intact. Everything sterile. Everything exactly where it needed to be because she'd made sure of it, 16 times a shift, for 6 months. Marcus was still frozen by the door. "Room check," Natalie said, her voice softening back to the register a nurse should use. "Make sure we have 2 units of blood cross-matched and ready. General's blood type is O negative. And called respiratory, get them in here to evaluate that vent. Go." Marcus nodded and fled like he'd just watched someone step out of a photograph. Natalie stood alone with the general, whose color was already pinker, whose chest was rising and falling with the rhythm of a man who'd come back from somewhere very dark. She reached down and checked his pulse at the wrist, strong, steady, full. The kind of pulse that meant blood was flowing exactly where it needed to flow. She realized, in the humming fluorescent silence of the ICU at 2:13 a.m., that she'd just blown the entire reason she was here. The general opened his eyes. For 3 seconds, they looked at each other. He didn't speak. Didn't need to. The look in his eyes was the look of a man who'd just watched someone save his life with the kind of hands that came from somewhere very specific, very classified, very far from an Atlanta hospital in peacetime. He blinked once, slowly, and in that blink was an entire conversation. "I know what you are. The question is, does anyone else?" Natalie stepped back from the bed. She wrote vitals in the chart with the steady hand of someone who'd just held another human's heart in her hands, literally, manually compressing it back into rhythm. The notation would read like every code in the hospital, patient responsive to ACLS. Sinus rhythm restored. Cardiology consulted. No one would read between those lines. No one would ask why the recovery nurse had known exactly when to push atropine, exactly how to count compressions, exactly what the cardiology team would need to hear before the first ring of the phone even completed. No one would ask these things unless they'd already been asking other questions. Unless they'd already noticed something was wrong with the nurse in room for 47. Unless they'd already started building a file. But that wasn't what would end her career in the next 46 hours. That wasn't what would blow everything open. That wasn't even the worst part of what was about to happen. The worst part was that Dr. Pierce had not been asleep in his home 2 miles away. The worst part was that he'd been in the hospital after all, reviewing charts in his office on the surgical wing, and he'd heard the code called over the intercom. The worst part was that he'd stood in the hallway outside room for 47 for the final minute of the arrest, watching through the window as Natalie's hands moved with a precision that no ICU nurse should possess, watching as she called out orders like someone who'd given them under fire, and drawing conclusions that were going to destroy everything she'd built. Dr. Pierce stood in the doorway of room for 47, his surgical cap still secured, his hands still pristine in latex. The monitors screamed their mechanical song. Oxygen saturation climbing. 76, 81. 88, the on-call surgeon had backed away, his competence exhausted, his protocols shattered by panic. But Natalie's hands moved deeper into the general's chest cavity, her fingers finding the heart like a pianist finding middle C. She didn't look up. Her voice cut through the alarm choir with the precision of someone who'd done this before under circumstances far more lethal than fluorescent hospital lighting. Epinephrine. 1 milligram 4. Push it now. The resident fumbled. A nurse, not Natalie, someone else, administered the dose with trembling fingers. Natalie's hand compressed the general's heart manually, the rhythm of her compression steady as a metronome, as if her body carried a clock built from muscle memory and remedy and the weight of keeping a man alive who mattered more than her own survival. Her jaw was set. Her breathing controlled. She was operating in a state beyond fear, beyond hesitation. She was operating in the state that only came when you'd already died once and refused the assignment. Sinus rhythm, the monitor announced. The room went dead silent. Natalie's hand stilled. The general's chest rose on its own. His heart had accepted the gift of electricity and compression and will, and had decided to keep beating. The ventilator took over the work. The machines recorded their victory in beeping, humming triumph. And in that silence, the general's eyes fluttered. His hand, even in sedation, moved with instinct and reached for Natalie's wrist. his fingers gripped with the strength of a man who'd survived more than one war, who'd watched people die in his arms, who'd learned to recognize salvation when it grabbed him by the collar. "Ghost," he whispered. Just the one word. A call sign. A name from another life. A name from Ramadi. Natalie pulled her hand away. "Wrong person, sir." But Dr. Pierce had seen everything. He'd watched her hands move. He'd heard her commands ring out like orders under fire. He'd seen the general reach for her like she was the only solid thing in a collapsing world. And he'd understood, in that singular moment of clarity, that everything he'd been assembling, every documented question, every note about her unusual knowledge, every conversation with the nursing director about concerning patterns, all of it had just become infinitely more valuable. The next morning, at 7:23 a.m., before the day shift arrived, before the hallways filled with the ordinary pulse of hospital life, Dr. Pierce filed a formal complaint through the hospital's electronic system. Gross violation of scope of practice. Emergency surgical intervention performed by nursing personnel without physician authorization. Citation of Hospital Regulation 7.3.2, non-physician personnel shall not perform surgical procedures, including but not limited to, thoracic interventions, cardiac manipulation, or any procedure requiring a scalpel or surgical instruments. He worded it carefully. Clinically. With the precision of a man who knew exactly how to kill a career using paperwork instead of bullets. By noon, he'd made 3 phone calls. The chief medical officer. The hospital administrator. The risk management director. In each conversation, his voice carried the weight of someone protecting the institution, someone ensuring that liability exposure was contained, someone acting in the hospital's best interest. It was absolutely reckless, he told them. We have protocols for a reason. What if she'd nicked a coronary artery? What if she'd infected the wound? We'd be looking at a $15 million lawsuit. I documented everything. I have witnesses. This is exactly the kind of incident that destroys hospital accreditation. Nobody mentioned that the general was alive. Nobody mentioned that every cardiologist on the continent would have frozen the same way the on-call surgeon had frozen, faced with a cardiac arrest in a post-operative patient with compromised vascular access. Nobody mentioned that in exactly 4 minutes and 37 seconds, the general would have been dead. By 3:11 p.m. on the second day, the termination letter arrived in Natalie's mailbox, not hand-delivered, not discussed, simply deposited like a grenade with the pin already pulled. Effective immediately. Terminated for cause. Gross misconduct. Violation of hospital policy. A requirement to surrender her badge and hospital credentials. Security would be notified if she attempted to remain on premises. Natalie read the letter once. Then she walked to her locker in the nurse's break room, locker 347, the same one she'd been assigned 6 months ago when she'd taken this position under her cover identity, the same locker where she'd kept her scrubs and her shoes and the small folded flag from her son's unit, the flag from Master Gunnery Sergeant David Martinez, who'd been killed by an IED outside Ramadi in 2009, whose body she'd carried across 100 meters of open fire, whose death was the only thing that mattered more than her mission, more than her career, more than her life. She reached inside and pulled out the flag. 3 by 5 inches. Creased so many times the fabric had become almost translucent. She stared at it for 13 seconds. Then she walked out of Cedar Creek Medical without speaking to a single person, without collecting her final paycheck, without looking back at the glass doors that slid open for her one last time. At 3:06 a.m., in an empty diner on Peachtree Street called Mel's, Natalie sat in a corner booth under flickering fluorescent lights and watched her coffee grow cold. The mug read Atlanta, where dreams come true, which might have been funny under different circumstances. The only other customer was an old man at the counter reading a 3-day-old newspaper. The waitress, name tag said Donna, had stopped asking if she needed anything around 40 minutes ago. Rain hammered the windows. Not a gentle rain. A rain that came in sheets, the kind that made the streetlights blur into watercolor smears, the kind that came when Atlanta's summer humidity finally broke and the sky decided to empty itself of everything it had been holding. The rain sounded like distant gunfire. It sounded like everything. Natalie's hands were wrapped around the coffee mug, but she wasn't drinking. She was staring at her reflection in the glass of the window beside her booth. The woman looking back looked hollow. 41 years old. Captain-ranked officer in a branch of service that didn't officially exist. 17 lives saved under direct enemy fire in Ramadi. 2 Purple Hearts. A Silver Star. A son who didn't know his mother's real job. A career that had just been erased by a man protecting his kickback scheme with hospital regulations and paperwork. She reached into her jacket and pulled out the folded flag. The fabric was soft now, worn from years of being held. She held it in one hand and looked at it, really looked at it, and for a moment that stretched like a wound, she considered letting it fall from her fingers. Letting it drop onto the diner floor. Leaving it there. Walking out of this life and into a different one. A life where she wasn't Captain Natalie Hayes, Special Forces operative with a security clearance and combat experience that made her permanently unemployable in the regular world. A life where she was just a nurse. Or just a person. Or just someone who got to have coffee at 3 in the morning without carrying the weight of 17 saved lives and 1 dead soldier. Her eyes burned. But soldiers don't cry. Soldiers don't break. Soldiers don't question the mission. She put the flag back in her jacket. The rain kept falling. The streetlights kept blurring. The old man turned a page in his newspaper. And Natalie Hayes sat alone in a diner on Peachtree Street, watching her reflection and wondering if saving the general's life had cost her everything, or if everything she'd lost had already been spent the moment she carried David Martinez across open fire and didn't make it in time to matter. And then she heard it. Distant at first. A sound that most people wouldn't recognize. The rhythmic thump of helicopter rotors, the unmistakable percussion of a Black Hawk approaching from the north, the kind of sound that meant something was changing velocity, changing altitude, coming down. Natalie's hand stilled. She didn't look up from her coffee. She didn't look at the window. She just sat there, very still, and listened to the sound get closer. The helicopter landed on the hospital roof at 4:27 a.m., rotors still turning, creating a wind that shook the entire building. Natalie didn't need to be told to come. She was already moving, already waiting, already holding the folded flag against her chest when the Marine in dress blue stepped into her empty apartment and said, "The General requests your presence." Not a question. It wasn't a request. It was a command. Cedar Creek Medical was different now. The hallway she'd walked for 6 months felt smaller, narrower, as if the walls were closing in on the lie she'd been living. Her badge was gone. Her access codes were dead. But the Marine walked beside her, and people moved. Nurses stepped aside. Orderlies straightened. Power wore a uniform, and it parted crowds the way a ship parts water. Room for 47 was where it had always been. The general lay propped at a 45-degree angle, chest bandaged, for lines running like tributaries down his arms. His eyes opened when she entered, and they held something that looked like gratitude mixed with apology. "Captain Hayes," he said. His voice was steady. "Thank you for coming." She didn't answer. Answers required words, and words were a luxury operatives couldn't afford. She nodded once, clinical, professional, nothing more. That's when she saw the second bed. The man in the adjacent room was thin, weathered, with the kind of exhaustion that only came from a life lived in shadows. He was watching her through the partial curtain with eyes that held recognition, not the polite recognition of a patient meeting his nurse, but the deep, bone-level recognition of someone who had seen you at the moment your hands were wet with their blood. He sat forward slowly, and when he spoke, his accent carried the weight of Ramadi dust and years of displacement. "Ash Shaba," he whispered. "Ghost. You are the ghost of Ramadi." The room went so quiet you could hear the heart monitor's steady rhythm, a pulse like a metronome counting down toward something neither of them could stop. Natalie didn't move. Didn't acknowledge. Couldn't, because acknowledgement would mean admitting that she had been someone other than what she pretended to be. The general shifted in his bed, and the movement triggered the third person to step forward. The Marine Corps colonel was tall, precisely carved, with the kind of bearing that suggested he'd commanded thousands and slept perfectly still. He opened a manila folder and began reading, his voice like a transmission grinding through gears. Captain Natalie Marie Hayes. Silver Star recipient for actions under direct fire during Operation Phantom Fury. He paused, letting the word settle. 17 lives saved under active enemy fire, Ramadi, 2008. Bronze Star. The colonel continued without breaking rhythm. Silver Star. His eyes never left the paper. 2 purple hearts. The room felt smaller with each medal. And a Navy Cross for extraordinary heroism in ground combat. The Medal of Honor was coming. Natalie could feel it building like pressure in a closed chamber. That's when the door exploded open. Dr. Pierce stood in the threshold, face purple, breathing like an animal that had been cornered and was about to strike. This is a restricted medical facility. These individuals have no authorization to be in this room. Security has been called, and I'm invoking my authority as Chief of Surgery to stand down, Doctor, the colonel said. Not loud. Not aggressive. Just factual, the way you might tell someone the weather forecast. I'm Colonel James Mercer, Naval Criminal Investigative Service Liaison to JSOC. This woman is active duty military personnel. This room is now under federal jurisdiction. Pierce's face drained. Not gradually. All at once, like someone had pulled a plug. The general sat up in his bed despite the obvious pain, and slowly, deliberately, he raised his right hand in a salute, a fist pressed to his chest, the gesture of respect between soldiers. This woman saved my life twice, he said, his voice filling the room like an engine turning over. Once in Ramadi, and once in your hospital. You're looking at the best medic Special Forces has ever trained. You're looking at a captain who bled for this country while you were bleeding your patients for profit. Pierce opened his mouth. Closed it. His hand started to shake. There's more, Colonel Mercer said quietly, pulling a second file from his jacket. Your documentation trail against Captain Hayes, the complaints, the fabricated disciplinary records, the termination letter, it triggered an automated compliance audit. That audit discovered 63 flagged transactions spanning for years. Inflated charges for post-operative care targeting veteran patients specifically. Insurance kickbacks routed through offshore accounts. We found $2.3 million in fraudulent billing, Dr. Pierce. Every dollar traced back to your signature. The heart monitor in the general's room continued its steady rhythm. BIP. 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 A pulse that wouldn't stop. A truth that wouldn't quit. Natalie watched Pierce's hands clench, unclench. Watched his jaw work like he was chewing on something poisonous. He looked at her then, really looked at her, and she saw the exact moment he realized that every weapon he'd forged against her had been turned backward, pointed at his own chest. The humiliation in grand rounds. The whispered conversations. The documentation trail that was supposed to end her career had instead ended his. You were supposed to be just a nurse, Pierce said. His voice had gone small, childlike almost. Broken. Natalie didn't respond. She just stared at him with the kind of calm that only comes from having already survived the worst the world could offer. 6 months later, she stood in the back of a community college classroom in a strip mall off Peachtree Road. Fluorescent lights hummed overhead, the same cheap institutional lights that hung in every hospital in America. Dr. Pierce stood at the front of the room in khaki pants and a polo shirt with the community college logo embroidered over his heart. The name tag read, Steve. He was demonstrating CPR on a plastic dummy, his hands performing compressions with mechanical precision, and when one of the students asked if he'd ever treated a real patient, Pierce flinched, an involuntary spasm that traveled through his shoulders like electricity. His medical license was framed in a legal document now. Not on his office wall. In an FBI evidence locker. The Georgia Medical Board had revoked it 3 months prior. The federal indictment listed 62 counts of fraud, and he'd accepted a plea deal that meant 5 years minimum, probably more. Nobody called him doctor anymore. Nobody called him much of anything. Natalie held the folded flag against her chest as the general presented her with the next assignment. The folder was unmarked, unremarkable, the kind of thing you'd carry onto a metro train without a second look. Inside were coordinates, names, operational parameters. A new hospital. A new cover. A new enemy that didn't know Captain Natalie Hayes was coming. But this time, she wouldn't have to hide. This time, when she walked into that hospital, everyone would know exactly who she was. Everyone would understand that the quiet nurse asking detailed questions about medication protocols and post-operative care was a warrior with a Navy Cross and 17 confirmed saves. Everyone would understand that power wasn't a title. Power was the ability to help. Power was a woman who'd held the line between living and dying, and refused to apologize for it. The trembling wasn't fear. It was restraint, the restraint of someone who could do 1,000 things, lethal and otherwise, and chose instead to heal. She didn't need scrubs to hide anymore. She didn't need the lie. Scars tell stories. And Natalie Hayes was done keeping hers secret. Subscribe for more stories about heroes nobody sees. Like this video if you believe that true power isn't found in titles or badges. Comment below, if you discovered your nurse had a Navy Cross, would you trust them more or less?